Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Got something a little bit different for you tonight. It's less horror and more in maybe the sci-fi or the post-apocalyptic vein. It's from a book I'm writing called Wanderer, and I thought maybe you guys would like to hear the first part of it. So, sit back and enjoy. He walked through the dead city, its sprawling boulevards flowing outward like the fingers of a catacomb. The city had been a great sprawling thing filled with sounds and smells and people going about their day once. He passed a billboard for a soft drink, Fizz Whiz, showing a glass bottle of sweaty liquid, and ran a dry tongue over his parched lips. Whatever a Fizz Whiz was, it would certainly go down a treat right now, he thought. The silence within this dead place was broken only by the groans of the damned. He walked this concrete cobra, putting the city behind him with the long strides of a practiced wanderer. To some coyotes, this place would likely be too good to resist. They would be drawn in by the promise of wealth and glory, but he understood that this was nothing but a shallow grave for the unwary. The damned and their crumbling steel tombs would stay inside until the buildings fell around their ears, unless some poor fool came searching for their secrets. He wasn't searching for riches, anyway. He left the city and entered the choked artery of the street, the Steel Horse Graveyard. "Stay close, Barb. I think we can make it to my car before they catch us," Jamie said, looking every inch a dime store James Dean with the revolver shaking in his hand. The two stayed low, glancing around like startled prey as they made their way through the hellscape of Chester Heights. He made his way through the city of dead hulks, pistol in one hand and the tattered comic in the other. As he walked among the wrecks, the damned turned their charred faces and marked his passing. Some strained at the nylon thongs that held them, while others clawed at the glass windows of the unmoving steel doors. He did not fear them. They were too far gone to operate the doors that would grant them freedom, and if one had managed to gain escape, his father's gun would make short work of it. They clawed and moaned, but remained trapped in their steel coffins. "Did you hear that?" Barbara asked, her voice high and tinkling. She clung to Janus, feverishly, but he shook her off and shushed her. "Hush, Barb, or they'll hear you. Then we'll crash." The pages crinkled as he turned them. The comic had been sitting on a spindle rack as he walked by, and the colorful cover had caught his eye. Tales of Horror, Volume 65, Escape from Chester Heights, was written in big block letters, accompanied by a picture of a rotting corpse with a row of teeth grinning through a hole in its cheek. It had been a welcome distraction as he made his way through the dead city, and he felt himself being sucked into the story as he plodded. He turned the page to see a horde of rotting corpses smashing their way free through the front of a store window. They reached for the couple as they shrank away from the writhing mound on the sidewalk. Jamie's gun bloomed a bright flower against the dark backdrop, but the hands kept reaching and clawing for him as the zombies unlimbered themselves from the pile. Dirty fingers grabbed at the cuff of his pants as the shaky sight wavered on them as he pulled the trigger again. Bang! Blood splashed across the bricks as another corpse fell. Jamie aimed again, but it was too late. The zombies reached for him, their nails dug holes in his jeans. They yanked him off his feet as he fell, the gun clattering to Barbara's feet. She stood horrified, her mouth locked in a silent scream that stretched across the word bubble like a wound. They drug Jamie into the pile of zombies, and the reader is treated to a frantic image of Jamie fighting to escape as the zombies bite and claw at his face and neck. He disappeared into the frenzy of bodies in a wash of blood and viscera, but not for long. He snorted a little at the concepts of bygone people. The zombies in the comic were very similar to the damned of his time. Both were ferocious, voracious, and possessed of an ever-present hunger that kept them constantly chasing their prey. These zombies, it seemed, could only be killed by a bullet to the brain, though, which seemed like a big advantage for them. All that potential was wrapped up in a package too slow to catch much of anyone, though. Not like the damned, he thought, who could outrun humans any day of the week. He turned the page and found that Barbara had picked up the gun and stood facing the pile of feeding zombies. They were hunched over, saving the reader from the obvious gore, but now one had lifted his face to look at her. It was dreadful, his mouth dripping with blood, the blood of her Jamie. She squeezed the trigger and the gun barked. The zombie fell off its haunches, a hole in its shoulder, but the bullet had done little but agitate it. The others, though, alerted by the loud bark of the gun, looked up from their lunch and turned their equally gore-streaked faces towards Barbara. They broke apart like a flock of slow-motion crows and came for her on shambling feet with groping hands. Barbara could do little but hold the gun and watch with dread as they came for her. His thigh bumped something, and he looked down to find 2 cars stalled on the road. Their front ends were smashed in, and one of the doors had been yanked unceremoniously open. Both were mercifully empty and had been separated after the impact enough for him to squeeze between them. He turned sideways and began to shimmy between them as his eyes snuck back to the pages. Barbara backpedaled, the gun held in both hands low at her waist like a kind of quivering manhood. Her death advanced in a slow, shuffling way as she staggered backwards in full retreat. Tears streaked down her face as she raised the gun to fire again. She pulled the trigger, the panel showing 4 shots before the last 2 panels showed only clicks and the shake of the revolver. He felt his long coat catch on a burr in the bumper, and he freed it with a little flick of his wrist. The cold metal on either side pressed against his legs as he squeezed between the long-dead hulks and heard them creak ever so slightly as they shifted in their silent vigil. He was nearly out of the canyon now, and the ease of the trip was making him complacent. The horror comic wasn't helping, and as his thoughts chased their tails, his complacency made him miss the subtle scrape of nails on concrete. The zombie in this story certainly had one thing on the damned, he thought. Scrape, scrape. The zombies closed in on poor Barbara as she sank to the pavement and covered her face with her arms. Scrape, scrape. Luckily for this world, he thought. Suddenly a pair of headlights fell across the quivering Barbara. As she looked up to see, teeth snapped around his ankle, and he fell the last few inches. He came free of the metal divide, and the damned under the car came free as well. The husk was missing both legs, but its arms were already scrabbling at his jeans as its teeth bit down on his leg. Fortunately, his mind told him as his free foot kicked the dam squarely in its scabrous head, the dam were sterile and could do nothing but keep their mortality to themselves. This was cold comfort, he reflected, as his leg began to throb, and he put down the thing that had bit him with a single shot. Chapter 2. The dog whined and huddled under the porch swing. They both stared at each other in mute accusation as the hole yawned accusingly in the boards of the porch. The dog had startled him, this growling mutt who'd come woofing from the shadows under the swing, and it was a miracle he wasn't wearing that hole right between his eyes. The two stood, unspeaking like performers who've forgotten their next direction, until his throbbing leg brought him back to the moment. He holstered the gun, sending a stream of frustrated air from his nose in the general direction of the dog. Then he took a step towards the door. The dog didn't challenge him again, choosing instead to whine beneath the porch swing, which offered no objections. It had a handsome brown coat broken by lines of white in several places, but it was drawn taut over a rack of ribs that hadn't seen a meal in quite some time. It was one of those breeds that's bred more for fashion than function, and in some vague and formless way, he was glad he hadn't shot the dog. It was an unpolished feeling, with no real sense of form, like sparing a particularly talented spider. The door was thankfully unlocked. The dying light lit the house and gave it a muzzy sort of feeling as the dust motes danced in an endless waltz. The front hall stretched darkly before him, and he slapped the flashlight against his palm before flipping it on. These batteries wouldn't last much longer, and he was hoping for some band-aids and maybe a fresh set inside. The light fell across a hallway of dusty photos, and this piqued his curiosity. He tried to push the door closed behind him and encountered a high whine instead. The dog looked up at him disconsolately as it stood caught in the doorway, and without thinking, he opened the door so the furry wanderer could come in as well. He didn't immediately know why he had done this, but he felt sure it was something he would know in time. His beam illuminated the dusty pictures, the last legacy of the owners of this home. They showed the two of them on their wedding day as their family gathered around them, smiling together as they stood before a great waterfall. Below that showed them eating an extravagant meal by candlelight, them sunning on a beach somewhere warm, and so on and so forth. The hallway stood as a shrine to these voiceless people who had once lived here, and it captured not just the great events of their lives, but also the day-to-day. Here he was painting their house, his clothes streaked with the effort, and there she was preparing a meal and smiling at the camera. As he moved closer to the living room, he saw Christmas mornings and Sunday picnics, trips to the beach and dinners with friends, pictures of happy times, and pictures of daily life that sat shoulder to elbow with each other. Despite the diversity and the lack of any real consistent flow, none of them seemed out of place. His leg throbbed miserably the whole way, but he found his only dissatisfaction came at the hallway's end. He found what he was truly looking for in the kitchen, a cabinet containing some lumpy cans and a bottle of clear liquid under the sink. He opened the cans and studied the contents, chunks of something swimming in a brown paste. He sniffed and found the smell satisfactory, but as he spooned the contents towards his mouth, he couldn't find it in him to eat it. What if it made him sick? What if it had spoiled and he spent the next few days and the last of his precious water nursing himself back to health? The dog whined beside him, nails clicking on the floor, and he looked down at him thoughtfully. He let a big glob of the stuff fall to the linoleum, and the hungry dog fell on it like a boulder. He licked his chops, looking up to see if there was any more, and wagged his stump of a tail happily. He obliged. 2 more globs hit the floor, and when the dog didn't fall into a quivering mass, he decided it was probably okay to eat. He shared out the rest of the cans between them, and when they were empty, he felt a little fuller. After a little more rooting around, the 2 of them ate their way through 4 more cans, and the mutt was finally satisfied. He belched contentedly, and looked down at the dog as he lay on the dusty linoleum. "Guess you were hungry too," he said, rubbing his springy fur absent-mindedly. After walking all the way here, and having such a big meal, he felt like sitting here and taking a nice long nap. He let his eyes slip shut, almost falling asleep, before his mind slipped back to the bite. Though he wasn't in danger of becoming one of the damned, he could contract a nasty infection if it had managed to break the skin. "Can't put it off any longer," he said. He winced as he lifted his foot onto the chair and gingerly pulled the boot off. He peeled back the sock and sighed happily when he found the ring of bruises around his ankle. No punctures, no blood, and only a busted ankle to show for the experience. He set about wrapping the leg, soaking the strips of cloth in the white liquid, and before long he had the sock and the boot covering it again. He'd get to keep the foot after all, it seemed, and that was a miracle. He had bruised his ass something fierce when he had fallen. Slamming into the car bumper on the way down, he had reached for his gun as the dam gnawed on his ankle. It gnashed its teeth against the soft leather, trying to strip away tender skin, but it held well enough against the incursion. He winced as it bore down, and the gun shook a little as he leveled the barrel at its head. He steadied his hand, no easy feat with a dam snacking on your foot, and pulled the trigger with a well-oiled click and a blast of thunder. His hands would need to be steady, after all. He wasn't in a big hurry to trade his foot for this thing's life. Its brains sprayed out haphazardly, and the swill buffeted him with a noxious perfume. Its jaw clamped feebly a few more times before it fell to the concrete and stilled. It wouldn't stay still for long. He'd seen them come back from worse, and he wiped the gunk off his jeans and kicked at it with his now hurting leg. He looked around for his glossy distraction and sighed as it lay congealing in a nearby puddle. He supposed that Barbara's fate would remain a mystery. The cars rattled on the trail behind him, and it wasn't hard to imagine the damned laughing at him. He gritted his teeth against the juddering din and began limping down the road again. He had limped away from the scene of the tragedy, and now he sat snoozing in the house he had found. All in all, it seemed like a pretty good trade-off. Chapter 3. With his leg bandaged and his stomach full, he thought a little nap would be just what he needed. He had just started to snooze when he remembered he hadn't checked the house for other surprises. Last thing he wanted to do was wake up and find one of the damned chomping on him because he had been too stupid to scout around before he went to sleep. So, with a heavy heart, he left the snoozing dog and went to explore the house. The house was modest, mostly kitchen and dining room, but he did find 2 bedrooms off the living room and began his exploration there. The hallway held more pictures, and nestled amongst them were a pair of closed doors. As he stood contemplating them, he heard a pitiful whine from behind him. He turned to look at the silent mutt, but the dog had eyes only for the left-hand door. His stare stretched 1,000 yards, and it was impossible not to become curious. It whined again when he reached for the knob, but as the door came open, the dog neither commented nor moved away. He also firmly chose not to follow. The bedroom that lay beyond was a macabre bit of poetry. 2 skeletons lay together on a huge bed, and their passing had stained the bed profoundly. The 2 had not been small in life, and it appeared their decomposition had soaked into the bed and the bedclothes, which left their final resting place a mess of dried brown and red. The woman, he assumed at least, since the dusty placard over her side of the bed read "Wife," lay posed on her back with her bony arms folded over her chest. Though she sported a clean hole in the side of her skull, her posing made her passing seem gentle, and it almost seemed as though she'd gone peacefully in her sleep. The other one, however, was a little more authentic. He lay spraddle across the bed, and the barrel of a small gun lay close to the entry wound in his skull. One hand held the antique gun, while the other was intertwined with the fingers of his dead wife as they lay across her chest. The two made a pretty picture there, lives and bodies intertwined forever. The dog whined again from the hallway, and he realized he'd been staring at the two for several minutes. It was standing in the doorway now, not quite inside, and had its head cocked inquisitively. It refused to enter the room, but seemed to want him to come out before he disturbed something better left alone. He would have rather left the two lovers to their eternal crypt. Would have if he had been a better man, but a coyote had to eat, and the master's bedroom was a treasure chest just waiting to be plundered. He turned to his work, and the dog left for parts unknown, silently disgusted. It turned out there was actually little of interest to be had. A pocket watch on the dresser, a silver lighter on the nightstand with the initials EH engraved in it, some money in a wallet, a shotgun in a chest, a box of shells for the gun in the sock drawer, a hairbrush with a silver backing, a necklace from a jewelry box. He looked around again, adding a silver hand mirror to the stack, when his eyes fell on the gun. It probably would never fire again. Certainly the barrel was clogged with decay, but that hardly mattered. Schaefer would do something with it, and the money would keep him going. He paused at the bed as he stood before the frozen lovers. He knew coyotes who wouldn't scruple to strip the clothes off the dead, and while he didn't count himself among them, his hand froze as he reached for the gun. It seemed unable to grab the object, sensing the gravity of it. It had obviously ended these two lovers, snuffed them out without a thought, and if allowed to escape, it might go on to end others. It might very well end love itself in its thirst for love, if he were so foolish as to free it from this bony prison in the dead man's hand. Such a storied weapon would likely fetch a much higher price, and Schaefer's store was full of such weapons. As he stepped away from the bed, having resettled the man's hand afterward, the dry crumble of autumn leaves greeted him. His injured foot had found a note, it seemed, and as he inspected it, he saw to his delight that it was free of the corruption on the bed. His eye was immediately captured by the looping artistry of the writer's hand, and he knew without a shadow of a doubt that this was the sort of treasure he was seeking. It was written, front to back, on heavy stationery, and the footprint he left on it had created a series of tremors across the surface, like dirty cracks on pristine ice. He did not fold the letter or stuff it into his bag, but held it up with the reverence it deserved as he took it from the tomb. He closed the door to the abattoir behind him, perhaps wondering if he would be the last to see these two. He was sure they would be happy for the privacy. The armchair in the living room puffed dust like some horny mushroom, but he barely noticed as he sat. He had come to plunder, come to seek his existence, but what he'd found was nothing short of his survival. He held his purpose in his hands, and they shook with a mixture of dread and anticipation that was only to be expected. A part of him didn't want to read this letter, but he knew he would. This was his duty, after all, his purpose in life, and he could no more stop it than he could stop his own breath. The items he had plundered from the couple's tomb were only so much clutter, so much noisy nuisance amongst more noisy nuisance, and he would trade it all gleefully for the words that lay on this one piece of paper. This was his true treasure, and as he sat in the dying light, reading it like a starving man reads a label on a can, he knew it was going to be a long night. Chapter 4. Mary sat before her mirror and wept. The gown was a perfect creation of lace and satin, with freshwater pearls worked into the bodice. Her hair had been curled and teased until it sprawled artfully across her head. Her makeup was tasteful and provided a perfect backdrop for her roaming hair. The effect of it all had transformed her from a plain, bookish girl into a dazzling goddess of white and curls, which only made her sadness more profound and more beautiful. The pen she held was fat and unwieldy. It and the stationery she was writing on proclaimed a similar legend: Samuel and Mary Worth, together forever. And whenever she happened to stumble over the missive, her agony broke open anew. The pen was meant to be a memento, a bauble to remember happier times, a touchstone of the joyous union between she and Samuel, not the bearer of such sad news as hers. She hoped he wouldn't keep this note, prayed that he'd throw it away in a fit of rage, but knowing Sam like she did, she had little doubt that this note would be a barb he'd sink into his flesh forever. My dearest Samuel. A tear dropped onto the words and blotted them a little as she wrote. I know you will not choose your happiness over me. so I'm taking the choice away from you." She paused, unsure of how to continue. How do you tell the love of your life that he is the source of both your joy and your pain? How do you inform him that you're setting him free without seeming dramatic? How do you sell a gift that is ultimately made of broken glass? She felt another tear fall onto the stationery and went back to her work. This was a labor of love, she reminded herself, and though every word felt like the most painful act of self-mutilation, she meant to have this gift delivered nonetheless. "I know that you have found your soulmate. I know that you met her a year ago, and I know that she isn't me. Tanya has been as dear a friend as I could have ever asked for, and you have tried so hard to disguise your love for her behind a mask of duty. I cannot find it in myself to be mad at either of you." She blotted the period savagely before writing "but" and putting down the pen to steady herself. That part at least wasn't absolutely true. She knew it, but still she couldn't hate them. She could be angry with them. She could concoct 1,000 different angry speeches for the two of them, but she couldn't hate them. They had fallen in love almost the second they had laid eyes on each other, but despite this, they had been nothing but loyal to her. She had never seen them be anything but chaste and friendly with each other, despite how they must be feeling. But when the two of them were together, they completed each other more fully than the most intimate act of love-making. When they talked to each other, it was as though no one else existed. She never had to feign interest in the things he loved, and he never had to pretend to find her charming. The two spoke easily, were together easily, and when the three of them were together, she found herself boxed in on occasions. On those occasions, she told herself she was being silly. She told herself that all women worry about this sort of thing. But after last night, "I saw the two of you together last night, and I saw something that I shouldn't have. I saw your true feelings." The rehearsal dinner had gone flawlessly. The meal afterwards had been scrumptious, and as she sat in the dining hall, enveloped in the afterglow of too much champagne and surrounded by her friends and family, she felt this may be the happiest moment of her life. She leaned her head over, meaning to place it on Samuel's shoulder, only to discover that he was no longer beside her. Figuring he'd gone to the bathroom, she slipped away from the party and made her way through the church towards the bathrooms. She came upon them together in the vestibule. They were kissing. They were not wrapped around each other like passionate lovers or trying to suck each other's faces like horny teenagers. They were engaged in one of those first kisses in which both parties are afraid to break the other. They were engaged in a moment of pure bliss, and all she could do was stand there, gawping. As they stepped apart, she could feel the anger, the confusion bubbling up inside of her, but as Samuel stepped away ruefully, his next words caught her by surprise. "I can't do this, Tanya. We can't do this." Tanya had begun to cry. I know we can't, but I feel like a bastard for even thinking it. It's just, when I'm with you, I feel complete," he finished. He didn't run to her, didn't take her in his arms, did none of the things you see so often in romantic movies or read about in the pages of the bodice rippers her mother loved so much. He just looked off sadly and walked out the front door, as Tanya slipped to the carpet and wept. "I've come to realize that your love for me, while genuine, is born of duty, and that this wedding is only for me. You loved me first, so you believe that you must sacrifice your happiness for mine. This is the last thing that I want." Mary hadn't known what to do at that moment. She'd retreated to the party, finishing it in a haze, and saw her guests off with as much grace as she could manage. She rode home with Samuel, got ready for bed. The two made love, and then Samuel went to sleep while she lay speechless next to him. She spent the hours of darkness that followed thinking about the last year of her life, meeting Tanya, introducing her to Samuel, the two of them interacting together as they swam through the same social seas. And the more she thought back to the two of them, the more she began to see herself as an outcast among them. She was a third wheel, a nuisance, and between the three of them rested a secret hatred for her, and a sense of shame for that hatred. She had wanted a good night's sleep, but now she would have settled for amnesia. She lay awake all night in a state of perpetual unsureness. She lay like this throughout the night, Samuel snoring a constant reminder that someone was sharing the night with her, and when the sky began to bloom outside her window, she rolled over so he wouldn't see her tearful sleeplessness. She scrunched her eyes closed as the alarm went off, and he climbed out of bed to begin his day. She lay in bed as he dressed and heard him bustle around downstairs before the door closed, the car rumbling to life as he pulled out of the driveway. She hadn't known what to do then, and she had got up and began to mechanically feed and clothe herself for the day. She hadn't known what to do as she went to have her hair done, went to pick up her dress after the final alteration, or drove to the church so she could get ready for her wedding, but the situation was her constant companion throughout the day. Samuel loved her enough to fulfill his promise rather than hurt her, but it was obvious that he was no longer in love with her. She couldn't keep him here, trap him in a cage that would turn from acceptance to resentment over time, and she certainly couldn't stay and watch the love of her life move on with someone else. When she picked up the pen that afternoon, she had known what she needed to do. I'm setting you free, Samuel. Let her complete you. Let her fulfill you. Live your life without regret, and never think of me in sadness. This is my wedding gift to you, and I hope you will cherish it always. I give you your happiness. When they came for her, all they found was a dress sitting across the chair and a note signed for Sam. Chapter 5. The light cut across his eyes, and he exhaled deeply like a corpse coming back to life. His fingers rustled something beside the chair, and he was aware on some level that it was the dog. It had curled up next to the armchair and lay snoozing on the dusty carpet even now. He sagged in the chair, spent and pleased, and was dimly aware that he had not slept all night. The light coming through the window informed him that it was early, and his sleeping legs and numb ass told him a story of a man who had spent all night sitting in that ancient chair. He got up slowly, stretching and feeling his back and legs pop, and he reached for his bag. He dug out the tattered old lockbox from the bottom of his bag and placed the letter in it. There it nestled amongst so many other letters, cards, journals, even an old VHS tape and a video disc, a box of lives that he had teased out with his curiosity. He closed and locked the box again and stuffed it down in his bag. He would keep this story as he had kept all the rest, and he would never forget even the smallest detail of what he had seen last night. How could he forget them? They were his purpose, his sacred trust, and he would carry them into the grave and beyond if he had anything to say about it. He was their guardian, their administrator, and he took their safekeeping as his reason for living. When he turned to go, the dog was already waiting for him. I suppose there's no changing your mind then, he said with a smile, aware already that the dog was meant to share his path. The perpetual smiling beastie sneezed once, and then resumed his eternal joy. Let's go then, wanderer. The dog woofed agreeably, and the two left the dying city behind them as the noonday sun rode overhead. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for today's story. Well, not a story, I guess more like a part of a book. I hope you enjoyed it either way. It's a little rough, I've got to clean it up some, but it'll do for a first draft. I've got a lot more stories about the man and his dog and his search for stories and the like. The storyteller is a character that resonates with me very deeply, and I hope you enjoyed hearing about him. So, before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Xaronana and Emily Coltsfoot and Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And thanks as always to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do it without you. Leslie Lou Riddle recently stepped up into our Ghost Reader tier contributor, and we thank her for it immensely. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video I do, as well as many other rewards that we've got down on the site, so come have a look. The 1st of July saw my Year 4 compilation come out, so if you'd like a copy, follow the link below, or you can always message me privately if you'd like a signed copy. I do like to put my name on books. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.